Hello and welcome to another episode of Other Record Labels. I'm your host, Scott Orr, where we talk with inspiring record labels about what it's like to run and start and be successful or have hardships as a record label. Today on the show, I'm very excited to have Alec from Brassland Records. You can check out more about Brassland Records by going to Brassland, that's BRASSLAND.org. They are celebrating 20 years in the music industry. In fact, they got started releasing the early National records, the first few records by the band The National. In fact, the label was started by Alec, who I'm speaking with, as well as the two brothers from The National. And so it's an incredible history in this label. And of course, those guys have gone on to do some really incredible things. And we talk about what that's like, having an artist move on to another label later in their career. But this label is also known for great artists like Doveman, who I'm a big fan of, and Bartees, who everybody's a big fan of right now. So very exciting episode. And I really hope that you enjoy this interview. If you listen to our show in real time, and by that I mean this episode is coming out in the summer, and so if you stick up to date with the show, I feel this, something coming this fall, where this fall is a time for people to hopefully get back on track and start to do things with a little bit more normalcy if possible. And what I want to do with other record labels is I want to continue to listen. I boiled the purpose of other record labels down to educating, equipping, and encouraging. And that's the whole goal of these interviews and of the entire platform and our website, otherrecordlabels.com. And under the educating and equipping banner, we have our free resources that you can download, as well as our advanced courses that you can take. And so if you feel that groundswell coming this fall, where, hopefully things are getting back to normal, and we start to rebuild our record labels or even launch a brand new record label, go to otherrecordlabels.com to check out some of the resources there that will hopefully equip you and educate you on getting better at running a record label. And the third tent pole is encouraging, and that's what I hope you get from these interviews and these episodes, is encouragement as we can commiserate and relate to some of the struggles that even more successful labels have, as well as be inspired by the things that they do well. Okay, so let's dive in. I'm really excited. I found some interesting things online. Nothing like it's not like a gotcha moment coming up or anything, but I'm just
no. I mean, you did some research, which is awesome.
So
yeah, we're kind of like a weird, for the number of artists that have done pretty darn well, whether it be the National, which is beyond what anyone ever expects about anything, or just like the bands that have had these very large niche followings or big cultural moments. I feel like we're a pretty low profile label, but there's a breadcrumb trail, and I've been a little bit more self-conscious about leaving one of late. So I'm excited that you found things, because probably intentional.
Well, that's actually what I like about your about your website too, is that your website, I'm a fan of minimal information, but I also sometimes like when a website, especially for these purposes of research, but your website just was like a place that you could camp out for an hour and listen to music or read articles or do a deep dive on the history or on you. So for this purposes, it was great. And there's oftentimes I'm going to a website and I actually want to be presented with as much information as possible. And I like that about your website.
Well, I think it's partially a nature of the fact that my background is in writing, and I'm somewhat of a scholarly dude, or at least, it's reading and writing are as much a part of me and to a certain extent of the label as music. And in some ways it's just leaving an archive.
Yeah, I think that's great.
At this point, you either are making a fashion statement with your website or being purposefully enigmatic, or you're creating a resource. And I wanted to create a resource very inspired by things like Discord Records, if you've ever followed that label, the sort of DC post-punk thing. But
no, I totally agree. And I think you're right. Excuse me. I think there are, you can be on either end of the spectrum. I think it might be a problem to be in the middle, where you try to keep things minimal, but then you throw in 3 paragraphs where it shouldn't be. So I kind of like picking a side. This,
Yeah, and a lot of the labels we try to be about a community. So I think drawing those connections is important, and it's hard to do that, especially in this age with no liner notes. Like you kind of need
true, yeah.
prose. You need your own prose to kind of explain how everything ties together. But yeah.
Okay, so 20 years this year, is that right?
Yeah.
That's pretty great.
Yeah,
does it feel like 20 years? Like,
it feels like a long time. 20 years blows my mind.
Yeah.
Like it's a little confusing. I think it's also worth understanding, like, the National didn't start taking off until like 2006, 7, 8, and the label wasn't really something that I would call full-time for me until like 2010, 11. So there are sort of like half-lives to be drawn, from the entire 20 years. It's not like I've been doing the same thing.
Yeah. Oh, I get
time,
that.
But...
Yeah, I get that. It's funny, like when you think of 20 years, because I was a teenager during 9/11, I always think that it wasn't that long ago. But then I see pictures of like what people wore back then. And I'm like, oh, that was a long time ago. It's crazy.
I was actually wondering, I mean, we don't have to talk about how old you are, but it sounds like you're a little younger than I am, because 9/11 was very much...
Yeah, I'm 38.
Okay, yeah, so a bunch of years younger than me, but yeah, we put out our first records, I always make our starting point vague, because I'm like, maybe we got the records back in March 2001, maybe we got them all back by July, but in a lot of ways, how I center things is the National did a tour in like October 2001. So 9/11 psychologically was a really big moment for us. So in that way, 20 years is very conceivable because of that major event that happened sort of between the time CDs arrived at my house, or the house that I've shared with Bryce, Dessner, and that first tour. Yeah.
It's amazing at how, no matter how long you've been around, you always think of yourself as young or just starting out. I don't know if that changes as years go on, but I still feel like the just starting out, or maybe it's imposter syndrome, but just figuring this out is still fresh in my mind.
Yeah, you never feel as old as you are, but I definitely feel like I've felt middle-aged for a long time, and I'm not against that. I think we've never been the youth culture label, maybe accidentally at moments we've had moments, but it's definitely not the... Yeah.
Okay, so tell me about the origins of this back in college with Aaron and Bryce.
Well, the origins didn't start in college, but I guess I met them in college.
Oh, okay.
Bryce and I went to school together, and him and his brother, and actually Brian Devendorf, the drummer for the National, were in a band called Project Nim, that I was, very much not from a scene that I was a fan of. And this was like an era before I cared about even classic rock. And by classic rock, I mean like Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan, Neil Young, like level things. Like I was like, what is that crap? I'm all about Fugazi and like whatever Touch and Go is putting out, like strange esoteric post-punk. And Project Nim was kind of almost like a post 10,000 Maniacs, connected to like, I think Dave Matthews Band was sort of like the aspiration back then. So, we were very much in aesthetic different places, but personally, I think we really liked each other's vibe. Like the hang was good. So we became pretty fast friends, and we founded the label, and we all found ourselves in New York, around 1999, 2000, 2001. Aaron, Bryce, and I all worked for a company called Funny Garbage, which was sort of a developer of kiosks for museums, like video kiosks and online experiences and websites. And Bryce and Aaron were the twin personal assistants to the kind of business director and the creative director of the company. Although Aaron really had a whole business development. Like everything Aaron does, he does very seriously and intentionally. And I think he was the most for real employee there. I was like a project manager. By that time, Bryce had gone to the Yale School of Music, and sort of become like this classically trained musician. So I think he was really expanding past his, this sort of jam band roots rock kind of background. And Aaron, as it turned out, I think had accidentally ended up writing songs in that context. And he sort of was busy more making like lo-fi demos.
Sure.
And I think it became apparent that like actually, you know, where some of the energy of their creativity was around adjacent to what at the time would have been called post-rock, you know, sort of Tortoise, Godspeed You Black Emperor, older bands like Penguin Cafe Orchestra, kind of whatever Brian Eno does. And Aaron, you know, I guess he wasn't making Pavement songs, but I think it was more connected to like Silver Jews. At the origins of the National, the bands I think that were really crucial to us, that everyone could agree on, were like the Sea and Cake, Silver Jews, very obscure.
Sure.
You know, now, although, you know, iconic to some, but obscure in like sort of a larger cultural history of the universe kind of sense.
Yeah.
Those were the bands that everyone could kind of agree on. And at that point, it was like, oh, we all kind of have some common ground here. So when Aaron had the first national record, before Bryce even joined the band, and Bryce had finished his first record with Clogs, which was with four classmates from the Yale School of Music, and it's kind of improvised classical music is I think the catchphrase that we would use to describe it. I was the person that listened to both and was like, hey, these could actually exist in the same universe, the same subcultural universe. I had kind of had a background, like even as early as high school, I had a cassette label that was called Brassland, and had done a bunch of zines and things like that. So it was kind of like a relaunch of Brassland, but actually with an identity, and with some higher-fi sort of proper recordings rather than these like lo-fi cassette things, which I take very seriously still, but
sure.
That good things can be made in the cassette format. But
where were people recording?
Definitely,
Where were people recording at this time? Where were the guys recording in the early 2000s? Was it at college or?
I'm trying to remember. Well, there was this guy Nick Lloyd who's still around and still connected to everyone. Like, you know, I think I saw he got a credit on the Big Red Machine record.
Okay.
I don't know if he recorded both the National debut and Clogs debut, but he was important, and it was definitely like the Pro Tools era had begun.
Yeah.
So it's not like those were not self-recorded records, but there might have been elements of like the National that were self-recorded.
Right. Right.
The Clogs was more going into a proper studio. I'd literally have to go and look up like where that first one was recorded. I know that I think by the third record, they were making records with Nick Lloyd at a place called Firehouse 13 in New Haven, Connecticut.
Okay.
So yeah, it was like not hi-fi studio recording, but it was kind of cobbled together with friends. We just happened to have some friends that had some decent resources. And in some ways, we're trying to sort of test, not the limits of their studio. We weren't making prog rock records, but they were trying to like get their studios on their feet. So yeah, that's how those were made.
So what inspired you to start a label? Because it's one thing, it's very common to be musicians, to form bands, to form lots of bands. But to say, especially back then, before the internet was what it is and manufacturing and home recording is what it is, it'd be a much harder process back then to start a label. So what inspired that?
I mean, I think Aaron and Bryce had, again, like the story of the Dave Matthews Band pressing up their own CD and selling tens of thousands of copies. Because that very much, like, no one thinks of the Dave Matthews Band as like a self-resourced group. But like Corin Capshaw, who was their manager, ended up, he's become a real music industry powerhouse. I think he's a partner in ATO Records,
sure,
he's a partner in Red Light Management. So like they sort of had that inkling, although we didn't really have investors or anything like that. So, we weren't thinking on that scale. And I think no one thought that the music was as accessible as that. But then I came from a background where I was extremely inspired by Discord Records, Touch and Go, Thrill Jockey, this whole Chicago thing that was happening at the time. It kind of has dissolved. And I think the history has been lost since Touch and Go collapsed in 2009 while we were a client of theirs. But, at the time there was this Chicago kind of thing going on where like that's, back when Arcade Fire kind of put out their first records on Merge, that was distributed by Touch and Go. So I kind of saw a possible on-ramp. Like I could identify like, ooh, if we could get this distributor interested in us, or these publicists or these people connected to this scene. There was actually a bunch of booking agencies there. There was this company called Billions, which at the time booked like everyone from Pavement to Nick Cave. Like they're not erased now, but they definitely have reduced in scale. But that was the scene. That was like the aspiration, I guess. And I had done cassettes before and had done some records and distributed some things. So it wasn't completely bizarre to me, the idea of making your own stuff. And my zine was like distributed in Tower Records and things like that. So like, I can't say we were good at things.
What was the investment like?
We had models.
What did it cost to do like 500 CDs or something?
Bryce, Aaron, and I feel like the price wasn't much different than it is today. Like, it was between $1 and $3 a unit.
Oh, sure.
Probably we were spending like, $2 or $3 a unit rather than $1 or $2 a unit because we didn't know what we were doing.
Yeah.
Or, we were just kind of coming in off the street. But the investment was Bryce, Aaron, and I put $5,000 each in a bank account. And
of course, wow. That's great.
We weren't paying for all the studio recording. I don't even know, like it's unclear to me if they were even really paying much for the studio recording of those first records. By the second record of the National, like there was some real investment being made on master production. But that $5,000 lasted us a fairly long time. There's never been a big infusion of cash. Since then that didn't come from sales, which is like.
That's really good.
Back and it still seems bizarre.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah.
One of the things I love about people investing their own money, and especially two individuals investing $5,000, is it really is putting your money where your mouth is. And I think so many people create this label, and all it takes is an Instagram account, a Bandcamp page, and a free logo that you sketch up yourself, or you get someone on Fiverr to make. And I feel like that. That's great. It breaks down these barriers, but it takes away a lot of the accountability that you would have had back then when you had $5,000 of your money and then $5,000 of your friend's money on the line. I think that's a really good thing to do. It's a brave thing to do.
Well, I definitely think, in the era of, coronavirus where people are, small restaurants are getting, at least in the States, are getting $5, $10, hundreds of thousands of dollars, like from the government to like, as sort of stimulus money. $5,000 doesn't seem a lot. I don't even know if it seemed a lot to us then. I think but it did give us some kind of baseline. And I do think anything you can do, I guess one of the important things for your listeners is there's like a certain pedagogical element. And I do think like, having some skin in the game and having some stakes and having some structure, it does help, as much as artists hate structure on many levels, or at least back in the day they did. I think artists are probably more into it than they used to be. I think DIY creativity and responsibility is more of a thing than it used to be. I think it used to be that you were looking for a savior. Generally, if you were an artist, you're like, who's going to touch me? Who's going to discover me? Who's going to invest in me? And I think pretty much anyone, like, I don't think you can get anywhere in the music industry now if you don't first invest a little bit in yourself. And I'd say, I think about the latest artists we work with, the biggest breakout we've had of late, this artist Bartees Strange.
Oh, yeah.
He very much invested in himself. It was very clear when I walked in the door with him, like, oh, this guy has photos. Oh, this guy's thought of himself. Oh, this guy has a finished record. And there's a cover for the record. Like, so I think that is important. Deal. And I think there's more of that going on than there used to be.
When did the part of the story I'm very curious about is when did the National move on from the label? And what was that decision like? Had that always been a goal or a plan?
Well, I think, first of all, the actual year, I think it was like by 2006 or something like that. It might have been 7, it might have been 8. I think Boxer was in 2008, so that was their second record on Beggars. I think our last record, we did the Cherry Tree EP in 2004, so that was like 3-4 years after we had started. Like it wasn't without like, oh, bummer, but it was also like obvious at the same time. time, if that makes sense. Like, I do think one thing that was part of the culture of indie at the time was like this sense of being betrayed and like, or going to a major label and you're ripping off your small indie label. And I don't think I've ever intuitively felt that way. I really think of us as having a role in an ecosystem. And for certain artists, our ecosystem can support their whole career. You know, I think I've worked with this band Buke and Gase for over 10 years now, and they're like a kind of left of center, pretty esoteric, but catchy enough that they've gotten sort of a fairly rabid following band. And like, or Clogs, you know, Bryce's classical group, like we're now going in over 20 years.
Wow.
Having represented their ecosystem. And for certain of our artists, it's like, this is the soil that's getting you started. And, you know, I think a 5-person band of dudes trying to make like sort of large populist live shows, like it was pretty obvious we couldn't keep them forever, you know? And that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I helped them find their first manager, like Dawn Barger, who, you know, looked after them for somewhere between 10, 15 years or so, was a publicist at the time who I was sort of interacting with as a writer. And it was, you know, it was clear, like at the time she was representing the Walkmen. Maybe she had started working with the Decemberists. Like she had a thing going, and it was like, this is the next step for this band. Yeah.
I'm always curious about labels who, you know, quote unquote, graduate artists. I think, I mean, for me, it was always kind of a dream. Like when I started a label, I knew that I wouldn't be able to necessarily get CDs into mall record stores, which were a thing at the time, and or to do whatever payola was necessary. And so I always kind of dreamed about that. I would think of it as a big accomplishment.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's happened to us a couple times. Like, I mean, the funny thing is, like, every time an artist has graduated, I've often had some kind of fingerprint on their graduation. Like, you know, this band, This Is the Kit, this British band who we've done a number of records with, they're on Rough Trade. And, like, literally my friend was the label manager for the U.S. Rough Trade at the time that we were putting out their records. And I'm the one who got Jeff Travis out to his first This Is the Kit show. And he ended up signing them. So... you know, but the other thing is, like, I also think how it works these days, like, you know, I still publish This Is the Kit's entire back catalog. I still have This Is the Kit's biggest song. You know, the income that those early records generate for Brassland, you know, is still a lot of ways the engine that keeps us going. And I'm hoping now with Bartees Strange, like, you know, he's probably going to be signing to a much bigger label very soon. And, you know, I'm definitely catalog building. I'm world building. I am community building. So community building, you know, like Barack Obama started as like a community organizer. And I don't think anyone in their right mind would say, well, you know what? You should stay with the local Chicago nonprofit that you were like the executive director for, or the, you know, like it just is like an outdated concept, I think. The idea that you should be holding on to things beyond when it makes sense. And I think, on the other side, like, I don't think we've wanted to grow Brassland itself. Like, I don't want to have 20 staff members or 100 staff members. So, you know, something has to give. Yeah.
I don't get the American Barack Obama reference. Did he go on to bigger things, or?
Yeah. He had some other jobs.
Started a company.
Yeah,
startup.
Sometimes that role doesn't work out that well. Sometimes you do wish that the person that becomes president didn't become president and stayed in their former line of work. But you know,
you know what? It must be pretty surreal seeing Aaron win a Grammy for Album of the Year. Like, did you guys manifest that back in your dorm room that would happen in 20 years?
Yeah, no. I mean, the last year has been deeply bizarre on so many fronts, and I think you know, it's like. I feel like I could just be talking about the common experience of like the election and coronavirus, and it would make sense to people. But then for me, it was like watching the whole Taylor Swift thing unfold, and then also watching, like, you know, again, like, I don't know if any of your listeners will know who Bartees Strange is yet. In a couple of years, maybe they will.
Oh, sure.
It depends. It's, I guess, probably their Pitchfork readers. So like that sort of coronation. kind of helps. But like watching this artist without being able to tour, who's a great live artist,
Yes.
be able to like essentially become like the DIY success story of the year throughout this year has also been bizarre. And like, so my last year, like we put out his record, and I can't remember if it was March 12th or March 13th, his debut EP, which was a bunch of national covers.
Right, yeah.
March 12th or March 13th.
Which is like the start of the pandemic.
One day we were at WNYC, literally start of the pandemic. Yeah. Like, so like one day he was doing a live session at WNYC. By the time we walked out, WNYC was like, yep, this is the last live session for at least a month. That night, the next night, I saw him play a show at this venue in Bushwick called the Sultan Room. And as I was literally going home that night, looking through my Instagram stream, I'm like, oh, wow, every venue in New York is closed for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
And I should also credit Fusilier, another artist of ours, played that same gig. So yeah, it's been a bizarre and exciting year. And yeah, I can talk more about the Aaron winning a Grammy thing.
Sure.
If you want. It's sort of self-explanatory. I mean, everyone knows about it, but it's been really cool watching. Yeah.
I want to talk about the label. I want to focus on the label, but was there a worry that the success of the national, and this is before the Taylor Swift stuff, but was there a worry that the success of the national would dwarf Brassland in the sense that people might dismiss the label because it was part of the early days? Do you think about that at all?
I mean, it's funny, like, to answer your question, it has dwarfed the label. Like, that's very clear, and that's fine, you know?
Yeah.
Like, in terms of cultural impact, just as I think probably for, Aaron and some of his subsequent projects, like,
sure,
Taylor Swift is always going to dwarf his projects, but, like, at the same time, it's also made all of his projects bigger than they ever would have been.
Right.
Because he got to work with Taylor Swift, even if he'll never be as big as Taylor Swift. And I think that's okay. I think, yeah, like you sort of find your level. It's kind of being okay with it and not sort of bitter about it. Like that's not what I'm trying to do, you know?
Yeah, right.
There was a subsection of your question that I feel like I'm not addressing.
Well, let me ask you another question, and I've asked this question to labels like Jag and Asthmatic, Kitty, and Brushfire. Like, how do you prevent or how do you cope with an artist from overshadowing your other artists on your roster? I mean, what is the mindset? I mean, you've got to be empathetic to some of the other people on your roster who may want to get on the Nationals label, but at the same time, they don't want to be overshadowed by those flagship artists.
Well, I mean, I think one thing that helps is I'm not looking for another The National. I mean, that's happened a bunch of times. I've actually seen, like, there's people there are low-voiced crooners who have come to us over the years and wanted us to do their records. And I'm kind of like, yeah, the fact that I did all of these, did help start this band, fronted by a low-voiced crooner, like, means that I probably don't 100%. Want to do anything that reminds me of it too much. It's like
it's so weird.
XL, I've had a friend of mine worked for XL for a decade, and I read like the book by what's his name, Richard. I'm not remembering the name of the founder of XL right now, but great book that he put about the history of the label. And the last thing they want is another Adele. Like you have to be that kind of label, and you have to have that kind of mindset. Yeah. I can't say we've done it as successfully as Jaguar. I mean, I think they have such a rich, thick roster beyond Bon Iver. Like, Bon Iver might always be the hugest thing, but I don't think they have been overshadowed. I think, to a certain extent, what I do exists in the shadow of the National, but like in a very diverse, non-imitative kind of way. Yeah. So that's maybe the way we've done it.
The artists that think to send, like, to copy Bon Iver and then to send a demo to Jag, or I talked about this with Mike Sniper from Captured Tracks, how right after Mac DeMarco, he got like hundreds of demos that sounded exactly like Mac DeMarco. And I just think, like, what is going through their mind? Like, you're absolutely right. The label is like evolving and should never, I mean, I can't think of any label who's, well, there might be some examples, who's just put out carbon copies of successful artists. or their own successful artists. That's so funny to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like artists are, frankly, because of the kind of work that people like yourself are doing, like more and more people are knowledgeable about how to do things. But I think a lot of artists literally, like, the traditional thing is the artist's thought process ends at making the music. And then they're just like looking for someone to connect with. So they just, I don't think they're doing it out of an area of thought. I think they're doing it out of a feeling of affinity. And like, I really want to stray from using the word desperation because it's such a cliche, but like, I don't think there's a lot of thought that goes into it when people try to sign to a label whose dominant artist sounds exactly like them. I think it's just like, it's flailing around. I mean, it's interesting what you're doing. You know, one of the inspirations for what I do, it kind of started with, does anyone remember the label Simple Machines? I don't think anyone really talks about them anymore. They were one of these like DC area labels. Like there was Teen Beat, Discord. They put out a guide like in the late 90s, this paper guide to like how to press up a record. It'd be, I think someone like you would love to find something like this. And it'll seem very primitive at this point. But it was again, when you had to literally like find United Record Pressing in a phone book and write to them before they had a website. And so back then there was, in the zine era, there was a bit of a like how to make your own culture out of Riot Grrrl, things like that. But I feel like, there's been a gap, and it's interesting to see a thing like yours trying to create that energy again. But I think, you know, in the early 2000s through the 2010s, I don't think there was a lot of that energy.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. I've kind of been, in my mind, been going back to what you're talking about, you know, with Bartees Strange coming into the label, with having his act together. And I find it so exciting when an artist comes in and they want to work just as hard as you. I feel like success is far more inevitable if you have two people who are pedal to the metal. What does the ideal artist look like for you? Maybe asking from an A&R standpoint, not necessarily creative, although it could be creative, but what does an ideal artist look like for you to work with?
I think the National are it. Bartees Strange is it. I don't think this is the Kit, and Buke and Gase are to a certain extent it, but in very different ways. Like, I think sort of intense self-sufficiency is very helpful. You know, when you realize that a band is able to tour without a tour manager and show up on time and deal with their agent and route the tour and do it in a sensible way and communicate to you when it's happening and do all those things, that's a great sign. But, you know, I'm not a label that would sign an artist just because they fit my ideal. It really is all about the music and connecting to that. You know, I've put out artists where I'm like, these people are great songwriters. This is a great recording. I don't know if this artist is ever going to be able to figure out how to play a New York show, but, you know, I think the song's going to stand on its own. I'm going to be able to get it in a TV show. I'm going to be able to make it, you know, at least get a start on streaming. Yeah, I'd say an intense self-sufficiency. Actually, just to be fair, like the sort of newest artist where we put a lot of energy into, Hannah Georges, who's a, you know, more of an established figure up in Canada that hasn't really gotten as much of a foothold outside of Canada. Right. She, I can tell, is like, you know, she can answer all the questions. She can make all the artwork. She can, you know, a certain professionalism. Yeah, totally. In terms of how they self-present and how they show up is super helpful. Yeah, that's a great point. Just this morning, I was sitting on the porch and I was listening to that Doveman record again this morning. That's just such a fantastic record, The Conformist. And it's also just exciting, too, about the work that he's done on other people's records, too. I always love seeing his name come up. Actually, yeah, I mean, I'm very curious how you discovered him, because that's not one of our... He's, I think, becoming a little bit more of a known quantity, but even his social media, like, he's sort of intentionally... obscure. He'd be a great example, frankly, of the counter. Like, him as a person is not an ideal artist like he doesn't really like to leave New York City. I mean, like that's an important thing to know about him. Like he's canceled tours opening for like fairly significant artists.
Wow.
Because he like didn't feel like leaving town that week.
Wow.
Who was he had a tour up the East Coast with Patrick Watson. And I think he ended up dropping off half the shows.
Oh man.
Like right after we had, or like within a year of putting out a record of his, but he's so creative and so sort of, I was going to use a really pretentious word. There's a cornucopia of music. Maybe that's pretentious, but it's less pretentious than the word I had in mind. Like, you know, so like I wanted to work with him because he's a great musician and a great creative energy, not because he was going to be a great touring, sort of super functional, like on social media, promoting the things he does.
I love that. I didn't.
How did you find him?
Okay, well,
I want to know.
Sure.
Record.
Well, I can only give credit to my friend Mike, who I will now have to tell to listen to this episode. I'm sure he doesn't listen, but my friend Mike, he will occasionally text me with something, and 100% of the time I've never heard of what it's very obscure what he sends me, and I wonder if he has this. He wouldn't have this record on vinyl. It's not on vinyl, right? He maybe has it on CD or something. Okay,
it might
that's
be
great
soon.
news.
That's actually that's
great news.
That's the thing I'm looking most forward to over the next year or two is trying to get a bunch of the back catalog onto vinyl for the first time. But yeah, CD
I'll pre-order one for sure. Anyway, yeah, Mike just said you have to listen to this Doveman record. You'll love it, and so I just kind of obeyed him. And I played it, and I did love it. So that was really, I didn't discover it myself, and I don't know how he did. I'll ask him, and I'll message you. But he's always looking for some weird stuff, and usually it's so obscure, and I've never heard of it. What he sends me, and I either hate it or it becomes like in my top 20 albums of all time. So I trust him.
Do you think it was it during its like release window, or was it?
No, I could tell you it was like 2013, 2014 time. Does that sound right?
A couple years after, but not a couple years later, but not far after release.
Yeah,
it's not like a decade later. It's not like you heard it 2 years ago.
No. Yeah. I'll ask him how he came across it. He always has like mysterious ways of coming across things. Okay, so I dug up this article you wrote called 19 Things I'd Tell People Who Want to Start a Record Label. I love it. It was so good. Can we go through it a little bit?
Yeah, totally.
Just a couple
and honestly, if anyone was going to ask for advice on my advice for starting a record label, that would be the first thing I'd show them.
Oh, I love it.
We're going to run into a stumbling block on the first thing, because I think I just listened to a short episode of yours. Should I start a record label? And your definitive answer is yes, and my definitive answer is kind of like the opposite. But
yes.
But anyway,
okay.
Go for it.
So number one is, if you tell someone how hard it is, if you, Alec, tell someone how hard it is to start a record label, and they ignore you and go for it anyway, then maybe they have a shot. I really do love that. I agree with you. I think persistence is such an underrated skill. Everyone is looking for the secret to playlists or SEO, but to me, it's just perseverance and persistence. Can you elaborate a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm trying to get across from that is not so much a no as like, it's hard and it's not sensible, like by any normal metric, to start a record label. It makes a little more sense now that sort of sometimes it's a function of an artist wanting to control their own rights.
Yeah.
And frankly, the fact that like literally no one will give you a start these
That's
days,
right. Yeah.
other than starting for yourself. But yeah, it was to kind of get across the fact that like, it's going to require persistence because it's not easy. I mean, I think and it doesn't get easier, and that's just the deal, like art is hard, I think is one way to put it. I think that was the lyric of a sort of late era emo band called Cursive. Although late era emo, they're always emos. I think we're on emo 5.0 at this point, but
fourth wave.
Art is hard, and I think that's worth understanding.
You said you're a reader at the beginning. Have you read the book The Black Swan by any chance?
Nicholas.
Yes.
Nassim. Saying, butchering his name. Yes, but it's been a while. Tell me what.
Okay, so he was talking about how I think they did a study of businesses, and it was something like 80 to 90% of all businesses fail and shut down. And then when they asked like new entrepreneurs, will you be in the top 10%, or and then it was something like 80 or 90% saw themselves in the top 10%. But the reality, even when presented with the fact that 90% of businesses will fail, 90% of people did not see them in that 90%.
Well, I think it's funny. I mean, I think what my first point is trying to get across is the sort of grit that it takes. You know, that's the buzzword that people are using, grit. But like, then there's also like the work ethic, and definitely a lot of people that found things and start things have more of a self-confidence, have more self-confidence than they have a work ethic. So like, it's been a lot of hard work for 20 years, and it's consistently hard work. And I don't think that first point really gets at it. But I think the people that are in the 80% but consider themselves in the 10%, I mean, whatever, there's also luck. But I think they might lack somewhat of a work ethic, but have the confidence to do things. But you know, there's also a huge amounts of luck. If anyone had told me 20 years ago that the National would be where they are today, if anyone had told any member of the National that, like, they would have thought you were crazy. Like, that wasn't, Silver Jews were the aspiration more than pavement was, I would say. And the fact that they're bigger than either of those artists now is crazy.
Yeah, totally. Number 2 is, and this is my core ethos when I started my label, but be against perfectionism. Can you explain this one?
I think it's just do it is kind of like just like get off your ass, get something out there. Don't drive yourself too crazy. I mean, like, look, to be successful, you're going to need a certain amount of intensity and devotion to craft and devotion to product, but like, don't go too far down. Don't get lost in your navel, I think, about level of quality or perfectionism, or like, it's a little bit better. Although I do think the other thing I mentioned, I think it's the 10th anniversary of somebody I used to know. I have a browser tab open with Stereogum, which is reminding me of that. And I know that guy a little bit. Wally. Yeah. And he's definitely a perfectionist. So he's like a counterexample. He literally made like the perfect song. And hasn't released anything since then out of a sense of perfectionism. So I think any of these rules I'm giving, they're not so much rules as they're conversation points.
Yeah. No, I think I still strive to make great things, and I'll make thousands of tweaks to mixes, and I do think it's important to rewrite lyrics over and over and over again. But it is very important to release things. I think it's important to be prolific. I think it's important to ship products, as Steve Jobs said. And I think too many people are precious.
Yeah.
Okay, let's hop over to number 4. This one I disagree with, but I want you to explain it to me. Consume more than you produce. I kind of try to do the opposite, especially when I find myself infinitely scrolling on social media. I catch myself and I go off and force myself to write something or to make something. What are your thoughts on consume more than you produce?
Yeah, it's possible it was too broad. I mean, it's also, I think that is speaking from the perspective of a label owner, you know, like, and a label putting things out. Like, I think if you put out 6 records a year, you should be listening to 100 records a year. It comes more from that perspective. Whereas like, I think some of the community you're addressing are sort of artists that are doing their own labels. But yeah, and I definitely, yes, the infinite scroll is,
I guess
it's like, that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, books, albums, it's actually something I'm trying to get better at. Because I've become definitely like a playlist person. They're usually my own playlists or you know, playlists by other creators and producers, not like whatever Spotify is spoon feeding to me about like, this is indie rock today. But I think, when I'm talking about consumption, it's more focused consumption. And it is more like, it's not consuming the endless scroll or the scattered playlist. It's like going into different worlds.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think there are different applications and there are different audiences for this. And sometimes if I'm listening to too many business podcasts or reading different perspectives or going to social media and viewing these different things, then I just start to doubt myself and the imposter syndrome overtakes me and everything. And I feel far more motivated when I'm just creating and making things. But I get exactly what you're saying. Just listening and not speaking and being quiet?
I remember visiting the National in the studio during, I don't remember what, it was a very confusing time, the mid 2000s, but it was somewhere between Cherry Tree and Boxer.
Sure.
Visiting them in the studio while they were making a record with Peter Cadis, who's been involved in most of their records since the mid 2000s. And I think I had made a CDR for them of like, this awesome song from the Yeah Yeah Yeahs and TV on the radio and like all these like things that were buzzing and knocking around Brooklyn at the time. And I remember Aaron, this is a paraphrase, but saying something to me like, yeah, like when we're in here, we actually can't be thinking about our peers. We can't be thinking about Interpol. We can't be thinking about, and I think they were thinking of a lot of those artists that were at the time doing much better than them. They were thinking of them in aspirational terms, but they did not want to get lost in those musical worlds.
That's a great point.
While they were literally in the studio. So I think what you said, look, this is not about either of us being right or wrong. It's about a conversation.
I want to find a winner.
The article I wrote is about opening a conversation, but I think you're making a great point about like sometimes you need to turn off the content to actually make stuff. But the point is to not just be completely lost in your own world. Like you need to exist in a context.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah. That's good. This number 8 says, take the long view. And this is similar to what we were talking about with persistence. And I've said this quote on this show a million times, so people are going to be sick of hearing it, but I love it so much. And I remind myself of it all the time. It says, people overestimate what they can do in a year, but underestimate what they can do in 10 years. So talk to me a little bit about like what the long view means to you and to Brassland.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of some of the stuff I was talking about earlier, like in terms of letting artists graduate to other labels. It's like, yes, I can take an artist to X point, but, taking the National or This Is the Kit to a place where they can sell like 5 or 10,000 records or get to, a bunch of songs to 1 or 2 or 3 million streams is great. But, what's actually going to be even greater is if a much larger company takes them to a much larger area of space and literally like the runoff from that success or the cultural context that it's putting them in, then lets us get This Is the Kit songs that we put out into like 5 or 6 TV shows that would not have happened if they were not on this larger platform. So that's part of the long view. I think part of it is understanding like there's no quick fix. And this has always been true, but it's getting even more true. Like culture, like forms of ubiquity are sort of necessary. It's my friend does that podcast Song Exploder, and there's a reason that he's able to get like U2, or I don't know if he's had Kendrick Lamar yet, but like he has huge artists on that podcast now. And the reason artists are doing it, these huge artists, is because they want to be everywhere. And it's just worth knowing that like there's no like quick fix to success. I remember, the records that we put out by the National were getting like spreads in the Fader when that was sort of I don't even think it's coming out in print anymore post-pandemic, but it was sort of like the au courant magazine to be in. We got a review in Rolling Stone, on the same spread of pages as Belle and Sebastian in The Rapture. Like I sometimes look at that scan, from back when that happened, and like you'd think like if you put them in this context, it would seem like they were huge, but actually that was just like the first of a million things, and they've outgrown Belle and Sebastian in The Rapture, but like just getting in that context didn't do it for them. So it's just understanding it's going to take a million things to get anywhere. Like I think that can be both intimidating, but it can also be helpful, to know that the mountain just keeps getting taller.
What does the long view mean for you as an individual, like as a professional, an entrepreneur? How do you view the long view?
It's been interesting. I mean, 20 years has been, I don't know if I think about it. I'd say I stay pretty focused in the today in terms of my work, which is sometimes quite tedious, the work that you have to do with a label. I think 20 years has been a time out to reflect a little bit on maybe taking a different kind of long view. Like I do feel like I'm possibly closing a certain chapter on the label at a certain point. Like I think I'm I'm getting an interest in looking a little bit at the history and making sure some people are aware of the history in a way I've never been. Like, I think a lot of times historicizing yourself can be confining. Like, you can sort of build your own coffin around you, but
Sure.
the 20-year mark feels like a moment where maybe I'm okay with doing that, or I'm open to doing that a little bit more. In part because I don't think I want to necessarily be running the label for the next 10 years like I've run it for the previous 20. Or maybe the better way to put it is I can divide it into eras. Like the first 10 years were definitely just like pure struggle and aspiration. I think if you talk, I don't think the National had day jobs by 2010, 2011 when we were 10 years old, but they were not far from them.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
And I think the last 10 years have been more like, consolidating the camp and consolidating like a sort of reputation. And I think the next 10 years might be something different. I don't really know what that is.
That's interesting.
Now, but I do think thinking in 5 or 10 year increments is definitely helpful rather than thinking about like what's going to come in quarter one. Like I've always avoided being that kind of label.
This is something I want to finish with this, and this is something I feel like has almost been the theme of this episode. But you said on this list that was further down the list, you said define success your own way. That's easier said than done. I love it. I think it's true, but I find it hard to do. I find it hard. I'm always moving the goalposts. I'm always looking at other people, but I love that. Define success your own way.
Yeah, well, I think it's not letting the world dominate what you do. I mean, for me, I think one of the things that's making me want to change what my role in the ecosystem of labels is I can see labels like, how do we make catchy 3-minute songs that don't disturb people? Because that is what works on Spotify.
Right.
Are relatively short recordings that can like work in the flow of other things. And it's not to say that playlist culture, I think sometimes playlist culture is sort of overstated how helpful it is. There are like huge, very difficult art metal bands that like you'll go to their records on Spotify and every track will have like about 1 million plays and they'll be like, every song is 7 to 15 minutes long. And you're like, this is not getting playlisted. Like people are just seeking this on these platforms. But I definitely think there's an energy to streaming right now that makes you want to package music in a certain format. And I think not changing what you put out to satisfy that is really important. I think, I look at like the Secretly family of labels, which I generally admire a great deal, but I do think some of the kind of artists that they worked with early in their history, like they're no longer working with because they can't figure out how to make it work in this sort of streaming era.
I see.
And, I think of something that like 4AD did. They put out a bunch of late era Scott Walker records. And I literally think they were doing that just because they thought it was awesome, not because they thought these were going to compete with their frontline signings. And I just think keeping things that are sort of odder in your sort of family is really important. And I don't want to actually be unfair to Jag Jaguar, as part of their like 25th anniversary celebration, did this tribute record to Richard Young's Sadie, which is like, is it Safi or Sadie? I'd have to look up the title, but incredible record from their back catalog. And I think all of them, I think they openly stated they got Sharon Van Etten and Moses Sumney to like do cover versions, backed by the Hypnotic Brass Band of this early classic in their catalog, which was I think 3 songs, none under 10 minutes long. I think it's important to never lose that energy. Don't let whatever. Speaking of a famous Canadian, like Marshall McLuhan's big thing was like the medium is the message, but don't let the medium define what you're doing creatively. I think it's really important.
Oh yeah, that is a big challenge. I do sometimes admire what the playlist culture is doing, and some of the income is nice, but yeah, it's when you start to write for that format, that's dangerous.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of music that's being made in this era and that's quite successful in this era that is going to be looked back at as the equivalent of like late 70s, early 80s disco, where it was like the Grateful Dead are making a disco album, you know, like just everyone was doing it. And there were really interesting things that came out of that. You know, I think like Sparks is an example, who like made a record with Giorgio Moroder that people love and see it as a highlight of their discography. But I think there's just a lot of fly-by-night cultural production happening because of the streaming thing.
But it's also, and it's also a prime time for the counterculture too. So hopefully something on the opposite end of the spectrum comes out of all of this as well.
There's always awesome stuff being made. Yeah. I think that's like the one thing. That music is never hopeless, and anyone that it might be more confusing than ever, it might be hard to wade through it, but like anyone that says that like music is worse is like a fool. Like it's just a foolish. Yeah. They're not a fool, but they're not trying hard enough, I would say.
Well, it's been said like every 10 years. People have just said that over and over. Listen, thank you so much for doing this. This has been so fun to chat with you.
Thank you.
And congrats on 20 years.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you go to brassland.org. That's BRASSLAND.org. Follow them on social. Check out what they're doing for their 20th anniversary. It's such an inspiring label to hear their story and to see them witness so much success and to see their artists move on. I think that's such a cool story. I hope that you found this interview helpful. Like I said, with this groundswell of the fall coming back into play, and you know, things changes, it feels like a new season, a new year. Make sure you go to otherrecordlabels.com, where we have these resources that will equip you and encourage you and educate you on being better at running and starting a record label. Thank you so much for listening.